Do employers favor women? Non-rhetorically, yes. Employers favor women and, of course, feminine men, but there's definitely a bias towards females in the workplace. And this becomes more true the more desirable the job is, e.g., in terms of pay, shift, etc. This conclusion is mostly based on the recent patterns I've seen during my attempts to break into tech slash IT. Of course, the last video I made, it goes over my recent termination from a IT call center job. So for context, that may be a good reference point as well. But um, altogether, this phenomenon was even it was subtle, but I would even say it was even evident at more manual labor or more blue collar jobs I've worked at. And with respect to the former, I briefly contracted as an automotive engineer at Stellantis in Michigan in 2024. Um, After a few months, I and several others in my cohort were laid off due to budget issues, supposedly. But what I found odd was that there were no females in that cohort. Granted, the employer had hired more guys than um, women that semester, but still there were enough women hired to definitely make me question how all of the women were just so much magically better at their job, such that they all avoided being part of the termination. As far as I know, whether it was with my cohort, I didn't even really hear it happening before or after that either. So, with respect to manual labor jobs, I would say the bias still exists, even though it's a little more counterintuitive. In other words, one would presume that in jobs that require more use of the body, men would be favored by the employer, given we are bigger, stronger, etc. However, given women, from what I've noticed, will ascend faster in one of those roles or even be able to phone it in per se, um, I would say that suggests otherwise. For example, I worked an overnight warehouse job at a Home Depot in Atlanta between 2016 and 2018, where I would say the female favoritism could still be observed. Not only were our two managers women, despite the team, like the bulk of the actual labor part of the team was mostly men, as far as who was doing like the real stocking and stuff, stocking the shelves and all that. Um, so yeah, there was that already kind of seeing it there. A team mostly of men being headed by women who were in a more favorable position. Moreover, even when a girl started on our team at the lower level, I would say shortly put, the propaganda, the neoliberal kind of propaganda, soon started flowing from direction of management to the men on the team. And the propaganda usually was centered around that the girl was outperforming us, so to speak, which thus laid the groundwork for her promotion if the opportunity ever arose, which I think it did. I don't remember what was happening in my last few weeks there, but I vaguely remember her going in a more managerial direction. Further, regardless of the work environment, regardless of the subject matter, a litmus test I found useful is an internal query, so to speak, much like the one I use for race. And it generally goes something like, I'll ask myself, would this have happened if I was a woman? Um, Whether it's a premature termination from an IT role, kind of like discussed in my last video, or even if it's something like, for example, a boss, like I had a blue collar job that I worked after getting laid off from the Stellantis job. I worked that job for like a year here in Michigan. Even at that, whether it's asking the general manager for a letter of recommendation and being denied for that, whether it's the former or the latter, for example, this query that I mentioned, the whole would this have happened if I was a woman, I find it to be a useful, if not enlightening, query. And more so, the answer, when I'm asking that myself, the answer is usually a resounding no. Granted, that reasoning may seem a little um, anecdotal or even sloppy, but given I have almost 4 decades of life experience, as well as an education that's trained me to process abstract concepts and think critically, I think it's a valid line of reasoning. So, altogether, to recap, female favoritism in the workplace, whether from white collar, i.e., more professional jobs, down to manual labor jobs, is evident. Moreover, if I had to give a quick solution, it would be for um, the Western status quo to produce jobs that reward male traits or at least don't overvalue feminine ones, e.g., compliance, and pay according to that. Though, honestly, I wouldn't hold my breath for that. With that said, thanks for watching and stay pissed.